My summer campers have an emergency word, and they said it when their counselor's friend arrived at the cabin. I'd been running Pine Ridge Summer Camp for 6 years when I hired Amber Kowalski as a junior counselor for the girls' cabin. She was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education, and her references were spotless. She'd worked at 3 different camps during her undergraduate years, and every supervisor praised her patience, creativity, and genuine connection with kids. The interview went well, and she seemed enthusiastic about the position, asking thoughtful questions about our safety protocols and daily schedules. I hired her in April, and she started when camp opened in mid-June. Pine Ridge was a small operation nestled in the mountains of northern Oregon, far enough from civilization that cell service was spotty, and the nearest town was 40 minutes down a winding dirt road. We hosted 50 kids per session in 2-week rotations, ages 8 to 14, with 6 counselors managing activities and supervision. I handled administration, emergency response, and filled in wherever needed. The isolation was part of the camp's appeal for parents who wanted their kids to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. For me, it was a dream job that combined my background in wilderness education with my passion for youth development. Amber fit in well during the first week, leading arts and crafts sessions and organizing evening campfire activities. The girls in her cabin, ages 10 to 12, seemed to adore her. She had an easy rapport with them and never talked down or over-explained things the way some young counselors did. The emergency word system wasn't something I'd invented, but rather something a parent had requested during registration. Laura Pritchard was enrolling her 10-year-old daughter Sophie for the summer session, and during our phone conversation, she'd asked if we had any protocols for kids who might need to signal distress without being obvious about it. I'd admitted we didn't have a formal system, but I was open to implementing one. Laura explained that Sophie had been through trauma counseling after witnessing domestic violence between Laura and her ex-husband. Sophie sometimes struggled with anxiety in new situations and needed tools to manage her fear responses. Laura wanted Sophie to have a way to communicate if she felt unsafe without drawing attention to herself, especially if she couldn't articulate exactly why she was scared. The idea resonated with me immediately. Kids often intuited danger before they could explain it, and giving them a simple, discreet signal seemed like basic safety protocol. I told Laura I'd implement a camp-wide system and train all counselors on recognizing and responding to it. We settled on the word pineapple because it was unusual enough that it wouldn't come up in normal conversation, but simple enough that any kid could remember it. If a camper said pineapple in a sentence, any adult within earshot should immediately assess the situation and separate the child from whatever was making them uncomfortable. I added it to our staff training manual and made sure every counselor understood the protocol before camp started. Sophie Pritchard arrived for her session in late June, a small girl with glasses and braided brown hair who seemed nervous during check-in. Laura introduced us and reminded Sophie about the emergency word, making sure she remembered it. Sophie nodded solemnly, and I could see the weight she carried, the hypervigilance that came from learning too young that adults could be dangerous. She was assigned to Amber's cabin along with 7 other girls, and I made a point to check on her regularly during the first few days. She warmed up slowly, making friends with a girl named Zoe Chen and participating in activities without the constant anxiety her mother had warned me about. By the end of the first week, Sophie seemed genuinely happy, laughing during swimming lessons and staying up past lights out to whisper with her cabin mates. I felt proud that we'd created an environment where a kid carrying trauma could feel safe enough to just be a kid. Amber had been particularly attentive to Sophie, I noticed, always making sure she was included in group activities and checking in when Sophie seemed overwhelmed. It was exactly the kind of counselor behavior I wanted to see, and I made a mental note to mention it in Amber's evaluation. The second week of the session started normally. We had a full schedule planned, a nature hike on Monday, arts and crafts on Wednesday morning, swimming and canoeing lessons throughout the week, and a special overnight camping trip on Thursday for the older kids. Amber seemed excited about the overnight trip and asked if she could invite a friend to help with supervision since we'd have 20 kids sleeping in tents. I asked who the friend was, and Amber explained it was her boyfriend, Derek Lansing, who'd worked as a camp counselor himself for several summers during college. He'd been planning to visit her anyway, and since he had experience with youth groups, maybe he could be useful for the overnight trip. I hesitated because we had background check requirements for all staff and volunteers, but Amber assured me Derek had already been cleared through the county youth services program for his previous work. She could provide his documentation and references. The overnight trip was Thursday, and it was already Monday morning, which didn't give me much time to verify anything. But Amber seemed genuinely helpful, rather than pushy about it. I told her to send me Derek's information, and I'd review it. She texted me a scanned background check from 2 years ago showing Derek Lansing had cleared for youth work in California, along with a reference letter from a camp director praising his outdoor skills and rapport with teenagers. The documentation looked legitimate, and we did need extra help for the overnight trip since it involved managing 20 kids in the wilderness. I approved Derek's visit with the caveat that he'd work under direct supervision and wouldn't be alone with any campers. Amber thanked me profusely and said Derek would arrive Thursday afternoon before we hiked out to the camping site. Everything seemed routine and reasonable, and I had no reason to suspect anything problematic. That judgment would haunt me for months afterward. Thursday afternoon arrived hot and clear, perfect weather for camping. The 20 older campers were excited and chaotic, packing their sleeping bags and arguing about who would share which tent. I was organizing gear in the main lodge when a silver SUV pulled up and a man in his late 20s got out. He was tall and athletic with dark hair and a friendly smile, wearing hiking boots and cargo pants like someone who knew what he was doing outdoors. Amber ran out to greet him, and they hugged briefly before she brought him over to introduce him. Derek Lansing shook my hand firmly and said he was excited to help with the camping trip. He had an easy confidence that read as competence, and I felt my reservations one's ease. We loaded the gear into backpacks and started the 2-mile hike to the camping site, a clearing beside a creek where we'd set up tents and build a campfire. The kids were energetic on the trail, singing camp songs and racing ahead before I called them back to stay together. Amber and Derek walked near the rear of the group, talking quietly and occasionally laughing. They seemed like a normal young couple enjoying time together, and I was glad I'd approved his visit. The camping site was beautiful, surrounded by pine trees with the creek providing a constant background burble. We spent the next hour setting up tents and gathering firewood, with Derek proving genuinely helpful by teaching some of the boys proper fire safety techniques. Dinner was hot dogs and s'mores cooked over the campfire, followed by ghost stories and songs as darkness settled over the forest. The kids were rowdy and happy, exactly how summer camp was supposed to feel. Around 9 o'clock, I sent the younger ones to their tents, while the older kids stayed up for a final round of stories. Sophie Pritchard was in one of the girls' tents with Zoe and 2 other campers, and I noticed she seemed quieter than usual during the evening activities. I attributed it to tiredness from the hike and didn't think much of it. By 10 o'clock, all the kids were supposedly in their tents, and I was sitting by the dying campfire with Amber, Derek, and 2 other counselors. We were discussing the plan for tomorrow's hike back to camp when I heard a girl's voice calling my name from the direction of the tents. I stood up and walked over to find Sophie standing outside her tent in her pajamas, looking small and scared in the flashlight beam. I asked what was wrong, and she said she couldn't sleep and could I check on something. Her voice had a strange quality to it, tight and controlled, and I crouched down to her level to ask what she needed. Sophie glanced toward the campfire where the counselors were sitting and then looked back at me. She said, "I was just thinking about how much I love eating pineapple. It's my favorite fruit. I wish we had pineapple here at camp." The word hit me like ice water. Pineapple, the emergency word. Sophie was signaling distress. My training kicked in immediately. I kept my voice calm and asked Sophie if she wanted to take a walk with me to look at the stars away from the campfire smoke. She nodded quickly, and I called over to the counselors that I was taking Sophie for a short walk and would be right back. Amber started to stand up, offering to come with us, but I waved her off, saying we'd only be a few minutes. As soon as we were out of earshot, I stopped and asked Sophie quietly what was wrong. She started crying immediately, trying to stay quiet, and I put a hand on her shoulder and told her she was safe and I was listening. Sophie's words came out in a rush. She said she'd seen Derek before. She didn't remember where exactly, but she knew his face, and something about him made her feel the same way she'd felt around her father before he got violent. She knew it sounded crazy, but her stomach hurt the same way, and she couldn't stop shaking when Derek looked at her during the campfire stories. She'd tried to tell herself she was being paranoid, but then Derek had walked past her tent earlier and looked inside, and the way he'd looked at her and the other girls had made her skin crawl. She remembered the emergency word her mom had taught her, and she knew she was supposed to use it if she ever felt unsafe, even if she couldn't explain why. I asked Sophie if Derek had said anything to her or touched her, and she said no, but the look in his eyes had been wrong. She couldn't explain it better than that. Just wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed to trust this child. Kids who'd experienced trauma developed radar for danger that adults had learned to ignore. If Sophie's gut told her Derek was threatening, I needed to take that seriously even without concrete evidence. I told Sophie she'd done exactly the right thing by using the emergency word, and I was going to handle this immediately. I asked if she felt safe going back to her tent with the other girls, and she said yes, as long as Derek wasn't near them. I walked her back to her tent and quietly woke Zoe and the other 2 girls, telling them I needed them to come with me for a few minutes. They were confused but compliant, grabbing their flashlights and following me away from the tents. Once we were at a safe distance, I asked if any of them had felt uncomfortable around the new counselor Derek. The girls exchanged glances, and one of them, a 12-year-old named Priya Singh, said Derek had been staring at them during swimming lessons yesterday. I felt my blood pressure spike. Derek had been at camp yesterday? Amber had told me he was arriving today. Priya said Derek had shown up late Wednesday afternoon and had been hanging around the pool area while they were swimming. Amber had introduced him as her boyfriend and said he'd come early to help out. He'd been watching them swim, and Priya had felt weird about it but hadn't wanted to say anything because Amber seemed happy he was there. I was suddenly furious and terrified in equal measure. Amber had brought Derek to camp a day early without telling me, which violated protocol, and he'd been around children without me being aware of his presence. Why would she hide that unless she knew I'd have a problem with it? I needed to get these kids somewhere safe, and I needed to investigate Derek Lansing immediately. I told the 4 girls we were going to walk back to the main camp right now, all of us together. They started to protest that it was dark and a long hike, but I said this wasn't optional and we were leaving immediately. I walked them back to the campfire and told Amber and the other counselors that something had come up and I needed to take these 4 girls back to the main lodge. I said Derek would need to come with me to help carry gear. The confusion on everyone's faces was clear, but I used my director voice that didn't allow for questions. Derek stood up looking puzzled and asked what was going on. I told him we'd discuss it on the walk. Amber started to argue that we couldn't leave the other 16 campers here with only 2 counselors, but I cut her off and said I'd radio for one of the junior counselors at the main camp to hike out as backup. This wasn't a discussion. Something in my tone must have communicated the seriousness because Amber went quiet, though her expression had shifted from confused to worried. I gathered the 4 girls and Derek, and we started hiking back toward the main camp. I kept Derek in front of me where I could see him and kept the girls close together. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Derek finally asked what this was really about. I said I'd received concerning information and needed to verify some details about his background. Derek's tone shifted immediately. He said he'd provided all his documentation to Amber and everything had been approved. I said I needed to review things more thoroughly. Derek went quiet and the tension in his silence felt dangerous. We were in the middle of the woods at night with 4 children and I was hiking with a man who might be a predator. I'd made a tactical error by bringing him with us instead of leaving him at the campsite, but I also hadn't wanted him near the other 16 kids. My radio was in my pack, and I was debating whether to stop and call for backup when Derek suddenly stopped walking. He turned around, and his friendly demeanor had completely vanished. He said I was making a big mistake and creating problems where none existed. He'd done nothing wrong, and these kids were just being dramatic. Sophie had been giving him weird looks all evening and clearly had issues. I told Derek to keep walking and we'd sort this out at the main lodge. Derek took a step toward me and said, maybe we should sort it out right here. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. I positioned myself between Derek and the girls and told them to keep walking ahead of us, follow the trail markers, and don't stop until they reached the main lodge. Sophie grabbed Priya's hand and they started moving quickly down the trail. Derek watched them go and then looked back at me. He said I was going to regret this and he had lawyers who would bury me in lawsuits. I said I looked forward to meeting his lawyers and he needed to start walking. Derek laughed, a cold sound that had nothing friendly in it, and said I really didn't know who I was dealing with. I pulled out my radio and called back to the campsite, telling the counselors there to get all kids into tents and maintain a head count. I said I was dealing with a potential emergency and would update them soon. Then I switched channels and called the main lodge, waking up the junior counselor on duty there. I told him to lock all cabin doors, account for every camper, and call the county sheriff immediately. I said we had a potential predator on site and I needed law enforcement here as soon as possible. Derek heard every word and his expression shifted from threatening to calculating. He said I'd just destroyed my camp's reputation over nothing and he hoped I had good insurance. Then he turned and started walking back toward the campsite. I shouted for him to stop, but he broke into a run, disappearing into the darkness. I swore and radioed the campsite counselors again, telling them Derek was coming back and under no circumstances should they let him near the children. Lock down the tents and stay alert. I hiked as fast as I could back to the main lodge, catching up with the 4 girls about halfway there. They were scared and walking quickly, holding hands in a chain. I kept them moving and we made it to the lodge in 40 minutes. The junior counselor, a 19-year-old named Oliver Grant, had followed my instructions and locked down all the cabins. He'd called 911 and sheriff's deputies were on their way, estimated arrival time 90 minutes given our remote location. I brought the 4 girls inside the main lodge and called their parents, explaining there'd been a safety incident and I was working with law enforcement to resolve it. The conversations were difficult and terrifying because I couldn't give them concrete information about what Derek had done, only that a child had signaled distress and I'd acted on it. Sophie's mother Laura went quiet when I mentioned Derek's name and then asked me to describe him. I gave her the details and she said, "Oh my God," and started crying. She told me to keep Sophie away from that man and she was driving to camp immediately. I asked if she knew who Derek Lansing was and Laura said she wasn't sure, but she'd seen someone matching that description at her daughter's school last year, a substitute teacher who'd been dismissed mid-semester for unspecified reasons. If it was the same person, there'd been whispers among parents about inappropriate behavior, but nothing formal. I hung up and immediately called the county sheriff's office back, asking to speak with the deputy coordinating the response. I relayed what Laura had told me and added that Derek had run back toward the campsite where 16 children were currently locked in tents with 2 counselors. The dispatcher said deputies were en route and had called for backup from the state police. She instructed me to maintain communication with the counselors at the campsite and keep all children secured at the main lodge. I radioed the campsite and one of the counselors, a woman named Kelsey Dunn, answered immediately. She said Derek had returned about 20 minutes ago and tried to convince them to let him into one of the tents to retrieve his backpack. They'd refused, and Derek had become agitated, yelling that I was paranoid and had created a crisis out of nothing. Amber had been trying to calm him down, but Derek had pushed past her and started walking toward the girls' tents. Kelsey and the other counselor, a man named Justin Frazier, had physically blocked his path and told him to back away from the children. Derek had threatened them and then stormed off into the woods. They hadn't seen him since, but they could hear him moving around in the trees near the campsite. Kelsey's voice was shaking as she described it. I told her deputies were coming, and she needed to keep every child inside the tents until law enforcement arrived. If Derek approached again, she should use the air horn we kept for emergencies. The next hour was one of the longest of my life. I stayed on the radio with Kelsey, maintaining constant communication, while we waited for the sheriff's deputies to arrive. The 4 girls sat in the main lodge common room with Oliver, drinking hot chocolate and trying not to cry. Sophie kept apologizing for causing trouble, and I kept telling her she'd potentially saved herself and the other campers from something terrible. I still didn't know exactly what Derek had been planning, but every detail that emerged painted a darker picture. At 11:30, I saw headlights coming up the access road, and 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled up in front of the lodge. 4 deputies got out, all of them armed and wearing tactical vests. The lead deputy was a woman in her 40s named Angela Park, who immediately took command of the situation. She interviewed me first, getting all the details about Derek's arrival, Sophie's use of the emergency word, my discovery that Derek had been on site earlier than authorized, and his threatening behavior during the hike back. She asked for Derek's full name, physical description, and any information I had about his vehicle. I gave her everything, including the license plate number from the silver SUV he'd driven. Deputy Park radioed for additional support and then asked me where exactly the campsite was located. I pulled out a map and showed her the trail route and the clearing's location. She said her team would hike out there immediately and secure the site. She told me to stay at the lodge with the children and keep the doors locked. If Derek showed up here, I should not engage with him and call 911 again immediately. I watched the deputies disappear down the trail with flashlights and weapons, and then I sat down in the lodge's office and tried to stop shaking. Oliver came in and asked if I was okay. I said honestly I didn't know. I'd made a split-second decision to trust a child's instinct and evacuate her from the campsite, and that decision had escalated into a manhunt through the woods with 16 children trapped at a remote camping site. If I'd been wrong about Derek, if Sophie had just been anxious and I'd overreacted, I'd destroyed my camp's reputation and probably ended my career. But if I'd been right and Derek was actually a threat, then waiting to verify it could have resulted in children being harmed. There was no middle ground where I made everyone happy and nothing bad happened. I'd had to choose whether to prioritize the camp's reputation or the children's safety, and I'd chosen the children. I had to believe that was right. Laura Pritchard arrived at 1 in the morning, having driven from Portland at dangerous speeds. She burst into the lodge and swept Sophie into her arms, both of them crying. Laura thanked me over and over for listening to her daughter and acting immediately. She said too many adults dismissed children's fear as overreaction, and Sophie's instincts had been right too many times to ignore. I asked Laura if she could confirm whether Derek Lansing had been the substitute teacher at Sophie's school. Laura pulled out her phone and searched her photos, finding a picture from a school event. She zoomed in on a man standing in the background and held it up. It was unmistakably Derek. Laura said his name at the school had been Derek Lynch, not Lansing, and he'd been hired as a substitute for a teacher on medical leave. He'd lasted 6 weeks before parents started complaining that he paid too much attention to certain students, particularly girls around Sophie's age. There'd been an incident where he'd asked a girl to stay after class to help clean up, and the girl's mother had raised concerns. The school had dismissed Derek immediately, but no formal charges had been filed because there was no concrete evidence of misconduct, just uncomfortable vibes and boundary violations. The parents had been furious, but the school administration had been worried about liability and defamation lawsuits. Derek had left, and everyone had hoped he'd just disappear. Laura had seen him a few times around town afterward, and always made sure Sophie stayed far away from him. The fact that he'd shown up at her daughter's summer camp using a different last name was terrifying, and suggested he'd been actively seeking access to children while hiding his identity. I asked Laura if she'd told the school about Derek using the name Lynch, and she said yes, during the incident last year, so there should be records of his employment under that name. I called Deputy Park and relayed all this new information. She said they'd reached the campsite and had secured all 16 children who were frightened but unharmed. Derek had fled into the woods before they arrived, and they were currently tracking him with dogs brought in from the state police. The deputies brought the 16 campers and 2 counselors back to the main lodge around 3 in the morning. The kids were exhausted and scared, and we set them up in the main hall with sleeping bags while I called all their parents. Amber Kowalski was the last person off the trail, and her face was a mixture of shock and horror. She came straight to me and said she had no idea Derek was dangerous. She'd met him 3 months ago through a dating app, and he'd seemed perfect, charming, employed, interested in outdoor activities. He'd told her he was a freelance web developer who'd worked at summer camps during college. He'd shown her references and background checks that she now realized must have been forged. She'd brought him to camp because he'd asked to visit, and she'd thought having extra help for the overnight trip would be appreciated. She'd let him come early on Wednesday without telling me because he'd surprised her, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful by sending him away. She'd ignored small warning signs because she'd wanted to believe he was a good guy. Now she was realizing she'd brought a predator directly to vulnerable children, and she was sobbing with guilt and horror. I wanted to be angry with Amber, but I could see she'd been manipulated and groomed just like Derek's intended victims. Predators were skilled at seeming trustworthy and normal. That's how they operated. The sun was rising by the time all the parents had been notified and arrangements made for early pickups. Nobody was staying for the rest of the session. Pine Ridge Summer Camp was effectively shut down for the season and possibly forever, depending on how the investigation played out and whether parents decided to sue. Deputy Park came back to the lodge around 7 in the morning and asked to speak with me privately. We went into my office and she closed the door. She said they'd apprehended Derek Lansing about 2 miles from the campsite. He'd been hiding in a small cave and the dogs had tracked him there. He'd been carrying a backpack containing items that were deeply concerning: zip ties, duct tape, a knife, and a prepaid cell phone with photos of children on it. The photos had been taken at Pine Ridge over the past 2 days without anyone's knowledge or permission. Derek was being transported to county jail and would be charged with multiple felonies, including attempting to evade arrest, violating state laws about accessing children under false pretenses, and possession of materials suggesting intent to harm minors. The zip ties and duct tape combined with his behavior suggested he'd been planning something significantly worse than just inappropriate attention. Park said the FBI would likely get involved because the cell phone photos suggested Derek might be part of a larger network trafficking images of children. My camp had accidentally become the hunting ground for a predator, and only Sophie Pritchard's emergency word had prevented something catastrophic. I asked Deputy Park how Derek had passed a background check if he was using a false name. Park explained that Derek Lansing was probably his real name, and Derek Lynch had been an alias he'd used while working at the school. He'd likely created a clean identity as Lansing with legitimate documentation while building the Lynch persona for accessing children. Background checks only caught people who'd been convicted of crimes under the name being checked. Derek had probably never been caught before, or had been operating carefully enough to avoid criminal charges. The school dismissal hadn't resulted in any formal record that would show up in a standard background check. It was a systemic failure that allowed predators to move from one organization to another as long as they stayed just below the threshold of criminal prosecution. Park said this was unfortunately common and highlighted why training staff to recognize warning signs was as important as background checks. She praised me for acting immediately on Sophie's signal and said I'd potentially prevented multiple children from being abducted or harmed, but the praise felt hollow because I kept thinking about how I'd almost not implemented the emergency word system, how I'd almost approved Derek without verifying his documentation more thoroughly, how close we'd come to disaster. I'd gotten lucky that Sophie had trauma informed instincts, and a mother who'd prepared her with tools to communicate danger. Most kids wouldn't have had that. The investigation into Derek Lansing consumed the next 3 months. FBI agents interviewed me, Amber, all the counselors, and every child who'd been at camp during Derek's presence. They seized his phone and laptop and found evidence that Derek had been operating in multiple states under different identities, gaining access to children through volunteer positions and short-term employment. He'd been particularly clever about staying under the radar by never staying in one place long enough to draw sustained attention. The zip ties and duct tape in his backpack, combined with searches on his computer for remote locations and sedatives, suggested he'd been escalating from observation to action. The FBI believed Derek had been planning to abduct one or more children from the camping trip, probably by claiming they'd gotten lost during a hike or overnight activity. The remote location and minimal cell service would have given him time to disappear before anyone realized what had happened. Sophie's emergency word had quite literally saved lives. Amber Kowalski was investigated thoroughly to determine if she'd been complicit in Derek's plans, but the evidence showed she'd been a victim of his manipulation. Derek had targeted her specifically because she worked at a summer camp and had access to children. He'd crafted an entire fake persona designed to make her trust him and want him around her workplace. Amber wasn't charged with any crime, but she quit working with children entirely, too traumatized by her role in nearly facilitating a catastrophe. The criminal case against Derek moved slowly through the system. He was initially charged with attempted kidnapping, possession of materials for child endangerment, evading arrest, and multiple counts related to the photos found on his phone. The FBI added federal charges related to transporting materials across state lines and conspiracy to exploit minors. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that he'd just been a concerned boyfriend checking on his girlfriend at work, and the items in his backpack were for camping purposes. But the photos on his phone destroyed that defense. They showed children at multiple locations over several years, always candid shots taken without knowledge or consent, always focused on young girls in vulnerable positions like swimming or sleeping. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. The trial began in January, 7 months after Derek's arrest. I testified about Sophie's use of the emergency word, Derek's behavior during the hike back to the main lodge, and his flight into the woods. Sophie testified via closed-circuit video so she wouldn't have to face Derek in person. She described seeing Derek at her school the previous year and the feeling of wrongness she'd experienced when he appeared at camp. The prosecutor built a meticulous case showing Derek's pattern of gaining access to children through manipulation and deception. They brought in parents from 3 other locations where Derek had worked under various aliases. Each told similar stories of a charming man who'd volunteered or been hired to work with kids, who'd seemed helpful at first but gradually made parents uncomfortable with his excessive interest in certain children. In every case, Derek had left before formal action could be taken, moving on to the next location and the next identity. The defense tried to paint Derek as a misunderstood person with social difficulties who'd made poor choices but had no actual criminal intent. They argued that the photos were just memories of places he'd worked and the camping supplies were innocent. The jury didn't believe any of it. The pattern was too clear and the expert testimony too damning. Psychologists explained how predators groomed both children and the adults around them, creating access and trust before acting. Law enforcement officers described the typical tools used in abduction scenarios. The zip ties and duct tape weren't camping supplies. They were restraints. After 6 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Derek's face remained blank as the verdicts were read, but I saw his hands clench into fists. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, and Derek was remanded to custody. Outside the courthouse, Laura Pritchard found me and hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. She said Sophie had been right to trust her instincts, and I'd been right to trust Sophie. Other parents from the camp were there too, thanking me for protecting their children, even though it meant shutting down the camp. Several said they'd send their kids back if I ever reopened, but I knew Pine Ridge Summer Camp was finished. The insurance company had already informed me they were dropping coverage due to the incident. The camp's owner had decided to sell the property rather than try to rebuild the reputation. I'd managed to protect the children in my care, but the cost had been my dream job and the camp itself. Sentencing day arrived on a cold morning in March. The courtroom was packed with parents, advocates, and observers who wanted to see justice done. Derek was brought in looking thinner and older than during the trial. His lawyer made a statement asking for leniency, citing Derek's difficult childhood and mental health issues. The prosecutor countered with victim impact statements from multiple families whose children had been photographed without consent. One mother described finding her daughter's photo on Derek's phone and realizing her child had been targeted as potential prey. The photographs might not show abuse, but they represented the preliminary stages of a predator selecting and tracking victims. The judge listened to everything and then addressed Derek directly. She said she'd reviewed his criminal history across multiple states and identities. This wasn't a case of poor judgment or misunderstanding. It was a pattern of deliberate predatory behavior. Derek had systematically sought access to vulnerable children while hiding his true identity and intentions. The only reason he hadn't succeeded in abducting or harming a child was because one brave girl had used an emergency word and one adult had listened. The judge sentenced Derek to 20 years in federal prison on the trafficking and conspiracy charges, with additional consecutive sentences from the state charges, bringing the total to 35 years. With good behavior, he might be released in his 60s. The courtroom erupted in applause and the judge didn't stop it. I left the courthouse feeling empty rather than triumphant. Derek was going to prison for decades and would be on the sex offender registry for life. The children were safe and the system had worked this time. But I kept thinking about all the near misses, all the ways this could have ended differently if Sophie hadn't been trained by her mother, or if I'd dismissed her signal as as anxiety. I thought about Amber's guilt and how predators destroyed the trust of everyone around them. I thought about the other camp directors and school administrators who'd let Derek slip away without formal consequences, prioritizing their institution's reputations over documenting danger. The systemic failures weren't anyone's fault individually, but they added up to an environment where predators could operate. I'd closed Pine Ridge Summer Camp, but I couldn't close the knowledge that Derek had been one person in a much larger problem. 3 months after sentencing, I started working as a consultant training youth organizations on predator prevention and emergency protocols. I taught the emergency word system and the importance of listening to children's instincts. I pushed for better background check systems that tracked people across name changes and state lines. I spoke at conferences about how close my camp had come to tragedy and what had made the difference. Sophie Pritchard's mother, Laura, became an advocate too, working with legislators to strengthen laws about predator accountability. Sophie herself continued therapy and slowly rebuilt her sense of safety. She sent me a letter on the 1-year anniversary of that night, thanking me for believing her when she'd said pineapple. She wrote that she'd learned she could trust her instincts and trust that some adults would listen and protect her. Derek Lansing will spend decades in prison, but there are others like him moving through systems right now, and the only defense is vigilance, training, and the willingness to act on incomplete information when a child says they're scared. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.